All right, welcome to another deep dive with us.
We experience the world through our senses, right? I mean, it's pretty basic. But have you ever stopped to think about the kinds of qualities we're actually perceiving?
Yeah. I mean, we see colors, we feel textures, we taste flavors. It all seems pretty straightforward.
Right. But philosophers, those deep thinkers who love to pick things apart, they made a really interesting distinction between what they call primary and secondary qualities. And this distinction has caused quite a stir over the centuries, believe me.
Yeah, it gets to the heart of some pretty fundamental questions about reality, doesn't it? What's really out there in the world versus what's going on in here in our minds.
Exactly. And it's not just an abstract philosophical puzzle either. It affects how we understand everything, from everyday objects to scientific theories. So today, we're going to dive deep into this primary secondary quality distinction.
This will be a fun one.
It will. We'll be exploring the ideas of some real heavy hitters in the history of philosophy. We're talking Galileo, Descartes, Boyle, Locke, and Reid. We've got a great lineup. And don't worry, you don't need a philosophy degree to follow along. We'll break it all down in a way that's clear and engaging, even if you're new to this stuff.
Absolutely. Our goal is to give you a solid grasp of their core arguments and really get you thinking about how you perceive the world around you.
Right, so buckle up because we're about to embark on a fascinating journey into the philosophy of perception.
Perfect. Let's kick things off with Galileo Galilei. He's often considered the first philosopher to really lay out this primary-secondary quality distinction.
Yeah, and this wasn't just some side project for him. Galileo was really at the forefront of a new way of thinking about the natural world, a way that emphasized careful observation, experimentation, and mathematical analysis.
And this approach definitely shaped how he viewed the qualities we perceive. So in his 1623 work, The Essayer, Galileo makes this bold claim. He says that secondary qualities, things like color, taste, and smell, are actually nothing but empty names.
Whoa. Empty names. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. He's basically saying they don't really exist in the objects themselves, but rather only in the mind of the perceiver.
So an apple isn't actually red. It just seems that way to us.
According to Galileo, yeah, he believed that if you could somehow remove all sentient beings from the universe, these secondary qualities would simply vanish. They'd be annihilated.
Hmm. It makes you wonder what the world would actually be like without anyone to experience it.
Right. And he used this really vivid thought experiment to illustrate his point.
Oh, I love a good thought experiment. Lay it on me.
Okay, imagine you're running your hand over a cold, hard marble statue. You feel certain sensations: smoothness, coldness, hardness.
Yeah, pretty basic tactile stuff.
Yeah, imagine doing the same thing to a living human body. Same hand, same movements. But the sensations are totally different. A tickle under the arm, the warmth of the skin.
Okay, I see where he's going with this. The hand itself hasn't changed, but the person being touched experiences all these additional sensations.
Exactly. And for Galileo, this shows that those sensations are happening in the person being touched, not in the hand itself.
So it's not like the hand possesses some magical tickling power or anything like that. The tickle is all in the mind, so to speak.
Right. And he argued that the same logic applies to other secondary qualities. The redness of an apple, the sweetness of honey, these are experiences that arise within us. The perceivers, not inherent properties of the objects themselves.
So it's like our senses are interpreting the world based on how we're wired rather than just passively receiving information.
That's a great way to put it. And this leads to a question that still resonates today. How much can we really trust our senses to give us a truly objective picture of reality?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Now, if these secondary qualities aren't actually in the objects, what did Galileo think was going on? How did he explain why we experience them at all?
Well, he believed that all the variety and richness of our sensory experiences could ultimately be explained by the mechanical interactions of tiny particles. He was a big proponent of the emerging corpuscular theory, which proposed that matter was composed of these invisible, indivisible bits of stuff.
Ah, the building blocks of the universe.
Exactly. So for Galileo, the size, shape, motion, and arrangement of these tiny particles were what he considered the primary qualities of matter, the truly fundamental properties that exist independently of any observer. And he believed that it was the specific configurations of these primary qualities that caused us to experience those secondary qualities.
So the redness of an apple, for example, isn't some mysterious property of redness inherent in the apple itself, but rather a result of how the apple's surface at the microscopic level interacts with light and our visual system.
Right. And he even started to speculate about the specific kinds of particles and interactions that might be responsible for our different sensory experiences. He suggested, for instance, that tiny particles emanating from objects might cause our sensations of smell and taste.
Fascinating. So even back then, he was trying to ground our understanding of perception in a more scientific, mechanistic framework.
Absolutely. And this line of thinking, as you might imagine, had huge implications for how philosophers and scientists would approach the study of the natural world in the centuries to come.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got Galileo's take on primary and secondary qualities. Now let's shift gears and try to channel another philosophical giant, René Descartes.
A great choice. Descartes, like Galileo, was a key figure in the scientific revolution, and his ideas had a profound impact on how we think about the mind, the body, and the nature of reality itself. And while he didn't explicitly use the terms primary and secondary qualities in the same way Galileo did, his philosophical system definitely points toward a similar distinction.
Right, it's kind of implicit in his overall framework. So what were the key elements of Descartes' philosophy that led him in that direction?
Well, there are three main things to consider. First, his famous theory of ideas, which was his way of explaining how our minds represent the world.
Oh yeah, the idea that our thoughts are like mental pictures or representations of things, that's a big one.
It is. And for Descartes, these ideas were the only things we directly perceive. Everything else, including the external world, had to be inferred from the content of our ideas.
Okay, so that's the first piece of the puzzle. What about the second?
The second is his understanding of the relationship between substances and their qualities. Descartes believed that every quality or characteristic that exists must belong to a substance, a thing that can exist independently.
Hmm.
And he argued that each substance has a principal attribute that defines its essence.
So for example, the principal attribute of physical matter is extension, the property of taking up space.
Exactly. And all the specific shapes, sizes, and motions of physical objects are just modifications or modes of that fundamental attribute of extension.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this relates to primary and secondary qualities. The primary qualities seem to be more closely tied to that underlying substance and its essence, while the secondary qualities are more like, I don't know, maybe appearances or sensations.
You're on the right track. Now, the third and perhaps most intriguing aspect of Descartes' philosophy that's relevant here is his notion of the union of mind and body.
Oh yeah, Descartes is famous for his mind-body dualism, the idea that the mind and the body are two fundamentally distinct kinds of substances. But he also recognized that in humans, they're somehow intimately connected, right?
Right. He called this the substantial union of mind and body, and he believed that many of our experiences, including our sensations, arise from this interaction between these two distinct substances.
So it's not just the mind passively receiving information from the senses, there's a more complex interplay happening.
Exactly. Now, with those three key concepts in mind, let's delve into some of the main issues that arise when we try to understand Descartes' implicit take on primary and secondary qualities.
Sounds good. What's the first one?
The first is perhaps the most fundamental question. Did Descartes actually believe that secondary qualities, as we experience them, don't really exist in physical objects? And if so, what was his argument for that?
That's a tricky one. Our sources mention that it's surprisingly hard to find a clear-cut argument for this in Descartes' own writings.
It is. He definitely talks about how our senses can deceive us and how we often make mistakes in our judgments about the external world. But she doesn't seem to offer a systematic proof that secondary qualities are purely subjective.
Some scholars suggest that he might have simply assumed this based on his overall commitment to a mechanistic view of the universe. If you can, in principle, explain everything in terms of matter in motion, then maybe you don't need to posit these extra qualities inherent in objects.
Right. And his focus on clear and distinct ideas that are free from sensory illusions and ambiguities, might have led him to favor those primary qualities, which seem more amenable to clear intellectual understanding.
Yeah, it's like primary qualities fit more neatly into his rationalist framework, while secondary qualities seem a bit messier and harder to pin down.
That's a good way to think about it. Now, the second issue concerns the metaphysical status of secondary qualities. What exactly did Descartes think they were, if not properties inherent in objects?
This is another area where there's quite a bit of debate among scholars. Some interpretations suggest that he viewed secondary qualities as mere sensations, mental events that occur within our minds.
But wouldn't that make them entirely subjective and disconnected from the physical world?
Right. And that doesn't quite square with the fact that Descartes also provided detailed mechanistic explanations of certain secondary qualities, particularly in his work on optics. He described how light interacts with different surfaces to produce the sensations of color, suggesting that he might have viewed other secondary qualities as having a physical basis as well.
So maybe he saw them as a kind of hybrid, something that emerges from the interaction between mind and body and between the physical world and our sensory apparatus.
Yeah, that's one possibility, but it's a really complex issue, and there are several other interpretations out there, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Definitely a topic for further deep dives. Okay, moving on to the third issue, the intentionality of our ideas of secondary qualities. This gets to the heart of how our thoughts can represent the world and whether those representations are accurate or misleading.
Right. Descartes famously claimed that ideas, by their very nature, must represent something. But he also acknowledged that our ideas of secondary qualities can be confused, obscure, and even deceptive. So how did he reconcile those two seemingly conflicting claims?
This is where his concept of material falsity comes into play. He argued that while all ideas are intentional in the sense that they're directed towards some object, those objects can include things that are essentially privations or absences.
So like thinking of cold as a positive substance rather than just the absence of heat.
Exactly. And for Descartes, an idea that represents a privation as if it were a positive real entity would be materially false.
Interesting. So it's not that the idea itself is fundamentally flawed, but rather that we might misinterpret it due to the way it presents its object.
Right. And he specifically applied this concept to our ideas of secondary qualities, suggesting that they often lead us astray because we mistakenly take them to be accurate reflections of the external world, when in fact they're more like sensations that arise within our minds.
So the redness we experience when looking at an apple isn't necessarily an accurate representation of some property inherent in the apple itself, but rather a sensation produced within us due to the interaction between light, the apple's surface, and our visual system.
Precisely. And this leads to the fourth and final issue we'll discuss regarding Descartes, the role of the intellect in our perception of primary versus secondary qualities. Did he think we use our minds differently when we're perceiving shapes and sizes compared to when we're perceiving colors and tastes?
This is another one where there's no easy answer. Some scholars argue that Descartes believed the perception of primary qualities involved a more direct and active role of the intellect, perhaps even drawing upon our innate knowledge of concepts like extension.
Yeah, it's like our minds are somehow structured to grasp those fundamental geometrical properties.
Right. And this might explain why we often feel like we have a clearer and more objective understanding of shapes and sizes than we do of colors and tastes.
But other interpretations suggest that the intellect plays a crucial role in both types of perception, helping us to organize and interpret the raw sensory data we receive from the world.
So it's not like secondary qualities are perceived purely passively without any intellectual involvement.
Exactly. And this view aligns with Descartes' more general emphasis on the unity of mind and body and the idea that our experiences are shaped by the complex interplay between these two substances.
Right. It's not a simple, clear-cut division.
Okay.
Okay, so we've covered Galileo and Descartes. Now let's turn our attention to Robert Boyle, who approached this topic with a deep commitment to his corpuscular theory.
Boyle was a fascinating figure, a brilliant scientist, a devout Christian, and a strong advocate for experimental philosophy. And his corpuscular theory, which proposed that all matter is composed of tiny, indivisible particles, played a central role in his understanding of qualities.
The atomistic worldview. It's been incredibly influential in the history of science.
It has. And Boyle really took this idea seriously, trying to explain everything from chemical reactions to sensory experiences in terms of the interactions of these fundamental corpuscles.
So for Boyle, the primary qualities, those basic mind-independent properties of matter, were essentially the mechanical affections of these corpuscles.
Exactly. He was particularly focused on the size, shape, motion, and texture, the arrangement of the parts of these tiny particles. And he argued that all other qualities, what we might call secondary qualities, could ultimately be derived from these fundamental mechanical properties.
So it's like he was trying to reduce the complexity of the world down to these simple building blocks and their interactions.
Exactly. Now, this led him to develop a very specific view of how qualities relate to substances. He saw qualities primarily as causal powers or capacities, and he emphasized their relational nature.
Relational, what does that mean?
It means that a quality doesn't exist in isolation, but only in relation to something else. Like a key only have the power to open a lock if that lock is specifically designed to be opened by that key.
Ah, so the power is in the relationship, not just in the key itself.
Right. And Boyle believed that this relational view applied to all qualities, including those we typically think of as secondary qualities, like color and taste.
Hmm. So for Boyle, an apple isn't inherently red. It only appears red in relation to our visual system.
According to his corpuscular theory, yeah.
Yeah.
He argued that the redness we experience is a result of the specific way the apple's surface, at the microscopic level, interacts with light and our eyes.
Okay, but how did he explain our intuition that things like color seem to exist independently of us? Like, we naturally assume that snow would still be white even if no one was around to see it.
This is where his concept of the dispositive sense comes into play. He argued that even in the absence of a perceiver, an object like snow would still possess certain underlying corpuscular qualities that would dispose it to produce the sensation of whiteness if it were to interact with a suitably sensitive observer.
So it's not actually white in the absolute sense, but it has the inherent potential to cause that sensation under the right conditions.
Exactly. And this dispositive sense, for Boyle, was grounded in the object's specific mechanical affections, the size, shape, motion, and arrangement of its constituent corpuscles.
Interesting. So it's like a kind of built-in capacity to produce certain sensations in us, but those sensations only become actualized when there's an interaction between the object and a perceiver.
Precisely. Now, this notion of the dispositive sense has been a subject of much debate among scholars. Some see it as a bit of a fudge, a way for Boyle to have his cake and eat it too, by trying to maintain both a relational view of qualities and a sense in which they seem to exist objectively.
Yeah, it can feel a bit tricky to wrap your head around, but it highlights a really important point. Our intuitions about how the world works are often based on our everyday experiences, which can be misleading when we're dealing with things at the microscopic level.
Absolutely. And Boyle's attempt to reconcile those intuitions with his corpuscular theory shows just how complex and challenging it can be to bridge the gap between our common sense understanding and the findings of science.
Agreed. Okay, so we've got Galileo's emphasis on subjective sensations, Descartes' focus on clear and distinct ideas, and Boyle's relational corpuscular account. Now let's move on to John Locke, whose treatment of primary and secondary qualities in his essay concerning human understanding is considered one of the most influential and widely discussed accounts in the history of philosophy.
Locke's essay, published in 1689-90, was a monumental work that aimed to investigate the nature, origins, and limits of human knowledge. And his discussion of qualities was deeply intertwined with his empiricist philosophy, the idea that all our knowledge ultimately comes from experience.
The classic blank slate view of the mind.
Exactly. Locke believed that we're born without any innate ideas, and that everything we know is derived from our sensory experiences and our reflections on those experiences.
So how did this empiricist perspective shape his understanding of primary and secondary qualities?
Well, for Locke, the distinction was rooted in a careful analysis of how our minds represent the world. He argued that our ideas, the mental images and concepts we form, are caused by qualities in external objects. But he also recognized that there's a crucial difference between the idea itself and the quality that causes it.
So the idea of redness isn't the same thing as the redness that supposedly exists in an apple.
That's right. Locke made a sharp distinction between the idea, which is a mental entity, and the quality, which is a power or capacity in the object to produce that idea in our minds.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection to his empiricism. It's all about the causal relationship between the world and our experience of it.
Exactly. Now, Locke identified two main types of qualities, primary and secondary. And he argued that our ideas of primary qualities resemble the qualities as they exist in the objects themselves.
So our idea of a round shape actually corresponds to the roundness of the object.
According to Locke, yes. He believed that primary qualities like shape, size, motion, and solidity are inseparable from the objects themselves, regardless of whether we're perceiving them or not.
Okay, but what about secondary qualities? What did he say about those?
He argued that our ideas of secondary qualities don't resemble anything in the objects. They're more like sensations or powers to produce those sensations in us.
So, like, the redness of an apple isn't some inherent property of redness in the apple itself, but rather a power in the apple to cause the sensation of red in our minds.
Exactly. And he believed that this power is ultimately grounded in the primary qualities of the apple's microscopic parts, the size, shape, and motion of its tiny particles.
So it's kind of like Boyle's corpuscular account, but with a stronger emphasis on the role of our sensory experiences in shaping our ideas.
That's a good way to think about it. Locke even used the analogy of pain to illustrate his point. He argued that just as the sensation of pain isn't actually in the object that causes it, like a pinprick, neither is the sensation of redness or sweetness.
That's a pretty compelling analogy. It makes you realize that our subjective experiences don't necessarily reflect the true nature of the external world.
Right. Now, Locke's distinction has been incredibly influential, but it's also sparked a lot of debate and discussion over the centuries. One key issue is whether he truly considered secondary qualities to be a kind of quality at all, or whether he really saw them as powers or dispositions.
Yeah, there's some ambiguity there. He uses the term quality pretty broadly, but he also emphasizes the causal role of these secondary qualities, which makes them sound more like powers.
Another issue concerns the basis for his claim that our ideas of primary qualities resemble those qualities in the objects. Some critics have argued that this is based on a kind of naive realism, the assumption that our senses simply give us a direct, unmediated picture of reality.
And that's not really how perception works, is it? Our senses are constantly interpreting and filtering the information they receive.
Right, so Locke's account has definitely been subject to a lot of scrutiny, but it's still an incredibly important contribution to the philosophy of perception, and it's raised some really profound questions that we're still grappling with today.
Agreed. Okay, so we've covered four major figures in this debate. Now, for our final stop, let's turn to Thomas Reid, a Scottish philosopher who offered a very distinctive perspective on primary and secondary qualities.
Reid was a strong critic of what he called the way of ideas, which was the dominant philosophical approach in his time. He believed that this emphasis on ideas as the immediate objects of perception led to skepticism about the external world.
Yeah, it's like that classic philosophical problem. If all we ever directly experience are our own ideas, how can we be sure that there's actually anything out there causing those ideas?
Right. And Reid thought this was a misguided way of thinking about perception. He argued that we actually have a direct and intuitive grasp of the external world and its qualities, without the need for any intermediary ideas.
So he was a kind of common sense realist. He trusted our basic perceptual experiences.
Exactly. And this led him to develop his own distinction between sensation and perception, which was central to his understanding of primary and secondary qualities.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me.
Well, he defined sensation as a purely subjective feeling or experience something that happens within us, like the feeling of warmth when you touch a hot stove.
So it's the raw, uninterpreted sensory input.
Right. And he contrasted this with perception, which he saw as a more complex cognitive act that involves both recognizing the existence of an external object and attributing certain qualities to it.
So when I perceive a hot stove, I'm not just experiencing the sensation of warmth, but I'm also recognizing that there's an object out there that's causing that sensation, and I'm judging that this object possesses the quality of hotness.
Exactly. And for Reid, this act of perception was direct and immediate. It wasn't based on any kind of inference or reasoning from our sensations.
So it's like our minds are naturally equipped to perceive the world and its qualities directly, without any need for complicated philosophical theories.
That's the gist of it. Now, how does this relate to primary and secondary qualities? Well, Reid argued that when it comes to primary qualities, our sensations are often faint and not particularly salient. We don't really focus on the specific tactile sensations we experience when we touch a round object, for instance. We just immediately perceive its roundness.
So the sensation is kind of a trigger for our perception of the primary quality, but it's not the main focus of our attention.
Right. And this, for Reid, indicated that our knowledge of primary qualities is more direct and objective. We're grasping those qualities as they truly exist in the world.
But what about secondary qualities? How did they fit into his framework?
He argued that with secondary qualities, the sensations are much more prominent and play a more central role in our perception. The experience of the color red, for example, is very much about the specific sensation of redness.
So it's like the sensation is more tightly bound up with our perception of the secondary quality.
Exactly. And this, for Reid, suggested that our knowledge of secondary qualities is more relative and obscure. We're not directly grasping the qualities themselves, but rather experiencing their effects on our senses.
Interesting. So even though he was a common sense realist, he still recognized that our perception of secondary qualities is more mediated by our subjective experiences.
He did, and this led him to some intriguing reflections on the nature of these qualities and how we investigate them. He argued, for instance, that there's generally no philosophical debate about the nature of primary qualities because they're so clearly presented to our senses and can be further analyzed through mathematics.
Yeah, it's like there's a kind of intuitive agreement on what it means for something to be round or square.
Right. But secondary qualities, being more obscure to our senses, are more subject to scientific investigation and debate. We need experiments and observations to figure out what's really causing those sensations.
So it's like primary qualities are more accessible to reason and intuition, while secondary qualities require more empirical methods to understand.
That's a good way to put it. Now, Reid's distinction, like those of his predecessors, has been subject to various interpretations and critiques. One key issue is whether he ultimately viewed secondary qualities as dispositions to cause sensations or as the underlying causal basis of those dispositions.
Yeah, that distinction can get pretty subtle. Is it the power to produce a sensation or the physical property that underlies that power?
Right. And some scholars argue that Reid's own writings are somewhat ambiguous on this point. Another issue concerns his claim that we can't even think about a secondary quality without also conceiving of its characteristic sensation.
He called this the capital parts thesis, right?
He did. And some interpretations suggest that this implies a kind of subjectivism about secondary qualities, that they're somehow essentially dependent on our minds.
But others argue that it's more about the way we come to know and understand these qualities, not necessarily about their ultimate ontological status.
Right. So there's definitely room for different interpretations of Reid's views, just as there is with the other philosophers we've discussed.
This has been a fascinating journey through the history of ideas about primary and secondary qualities. It's amazing to see how these thinkers, separated by time and philosophical perspectives, grappled with such fundamental questions about how we perceive and understand the world around us.
Absolutely. And their insights are still incredibly relevant today, as we continue to explore the nature of perception, consciousness, and reality itself, both through philosophy and through scientific investigation. So as you go about your day, pay attention to your own sensory experiences. Think about the colors, tastes, smells, and textures you encounter, and consider how your own understanding of these qualities might align with or diverge from the ideas of these great philosophical minds.
Yeah, it's a great way to engage with these deep questions in a more personal and immediate way. Who knows, maybe you'll even come up with your own unique perspective on this enduring philosophical puzzle.
Maybe you will. And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to delve further into the original works of these philosophers. There's a wealth of fascinating ideas waiting to be discovered, and we guarantee it'll give you a whole new appreciation for the richness and complexity of our perceptual experience.
It's a journey worth taking.
It certainly is.